This week on The Right Side, a story of narrative with the overblown IamLinda conversation versus the dishonesty of Canada's Defence Minister Harjit Sajjan. The BC chapter of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation has a look at the party platforms, and we have a talk about consequences. This is The Right Side, episode 15, recorded Saturday, May 6th, 2017. IamLinda versus Sajjan. Hello everybody, and welcome to The Right Side, episode 15, coming at you right now. Patrick and I are here as we normally do this show every Saturday.
Yeah, except for the one time where we didn't do it on Saturday, but as usual, it's Saturday, so we are here for you.
That resulted in a very important special about the Conservative leadership race, which was upended the week after by the departure of Kevin O'Leary, but that was last week's news. We do have a whole boatload of news this week to mention and discuss. You guys got that BC election coming up in a few days, so it's safe to say that's where we're going to be focusing.
Yeah, Tuesday, May 9th, everyone goes to the polls, and we find out who the next premier is going to be, if it's going to remain Christy Clark and the Liberals, or if something else wacky is going to happen.
Or maybe the Greens will form government for the first time.
Yeah. Or maybe, maybe hell will freeze over. Who knows what happens?
Well,
right?
There's a story here in Alberta that we don't, relegate parties to opposition and bring them back. If a party has served its term in government, they're done and they're never heard from again. The last time the Liberals formed government in Alberta was 1921. The Social Credit formed government for, I believe, what was a good 30 years or so, give or take, and after that, they were never heard from again in government. And, we don't have the normal opposition cycle that you guys have. So, it's entirely feasible that a new party could spontaneously emerge in BC and become the main event.
That's very true, and a lot of the time that is the case in BC as well, where a lot of times the ruling party will lose and then gets dissolved and then forms into other parties. But the only party that seems to be the exception to that is, of course, the BC NDP, who, like a bad sore, just keep coming back. And I think that leads nicely into our first news story, which is the headline, "The Manufactured Outrage of #IamLinda." So, this past week's BC story highlights yet another danger of social media, in my view. So, just to give a bit of a background there, in the last week of April, Premier Clark was campaigning with local Liberal candidates in a North Vancouver grocery store, which, a lot of the candidates do, all the parties do it. And a local resident named Linda Higgins came over to Clark and started off what would later become a conversation that the media outlets said portrayed the Liberals as arrogant, aloof, and uncaring. Those were separate quotes found from many different articles and news stories that aired after the fact. So, what was this conversation? What was it that Clark did that was so bad? So basically, you can view this on YouTube. Just search for IamLinda and it'll be the first result. Higgins basically introduced herself to Linda Clark, said her name, said hi, and then Clark replied, said, "Nice to meet you, Linda." And then Higgins immediately right after that fired back quickly with, "I'll never vote for you," which Clark then replied, "You don't have to. That's why we live in a democracy." She then walked away to meet other people who were waiting to talk to her. As Clark walks away, Higgins replies with, "Thank goodness, hopefully you won't get elected in," and then turns towards the news camera, which is filming the entire encounter.
This story just reeks so far of one of those Hollywood or Atlanta reality TV shows where, people are, making outrageous accusations and outrageous actions just because it's on reality TV, which that's what this is sounding like, but I'll let you continue.
It really did seem like a really bad soap opera, to be honest. And the fact that it created such a firestorm afterwards, it was really surprising considering it was such a harmless thing. Basically, after the story was aired on the evening news that night, it blew up on social media with people who were basically anti-liberals or anti-government, and the slacktivism rallying cry became hashtag IamLinda, suggesting that the people on Twitter sympathized with Higgins and wished that they too could tell Clark that they weren't voting for her.
And then
and
let
this
me guess.
basically,
Then let me guess. The media loved this story because it was viral and, oh, we're just doing our great job of informing the populace of what's going on. And they continued on the drubbing streak on this.
Oh, yeah, exactly, because that's what they always do. It basically led to the news media posting or mentioning certain Twitter links or Twitter messages that insulted the liberals. And I think something that everyone has to remember is that when the media wants to say something but they can't because of libel laws, they'll reprint or show what other people say on Twitter as fact to suit their narrative. And basically what happened there is they started retweeting that the story had gone viral on Twitter, and they showed a bunch of people on Twitter saying, "Well, I'm never going to vote for Clark either. I am Linda."
Yeah.
And
This also proves that social media is disastrous and slacktivism is disastrous, unless, of course, you're the one pulling the strings and controlling everything. And then, of course, you're one of the very few power brokers that exists online in social media, which is the way it works with social bubbles and all that.
yeah, and speaking of controlling everything, a few days later, after the incident would normally blow over in a normal news cycle, the media ran with the headlines, quote, "No apology from Clark as BC Liberals throw in the hashtag IamLinda towel." And another article came out saying hashtag IamLinda encounter continues to plague Christy Clark and BC Liberals. I mean, when you read those, what are they really trying to suggest with the headlines?
That is pure sensationalism right there, and that's, of course, the main thing we strive to cut through here at the right side. And I would have problems with all the major parties that are running if I was in BC and was voting for this election. But at the end of the day, what's going on here really should have been easily countered by the entirety of the Liberal caucus and all of the Liberal candidates on Twitter. Because, I mean, if you don't control the narrative on Twitter these days, you're being controlled by the media and, in general, the wider populace.
Yeah, and basically what the problem was is that the campaign director, Laura Miller, tried to change that narrative by saying that Linda Higgins was an NDP plant sent there simply to disrupt them and whatnot and make Clark
smart.
look bad, and it wasn't really something that is very good to do, because it's not really something. Yeah, and it's not exactly something that can be proven anyways. They could just deny it and say, well, you're crazy, and then it just makes them look further bad. So, I mean,
I think the correct course of action here would have been for a coordinated social blitz from the Liberals and the Liberal supporters, focusing in on the dishonest nature of the media, and, of course, also the NDP with that. I think that's something that people need to be aware of in the modern world when campaigning, is that it's not just the on-the-ground game. It's that if you don't control the narrative online as well, you're in trouble. Because, as we see, the media loves reprinting tweets for some odd reason.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what the media is missing is that by not engaging in an argument with someone who obviously didn't want to change their mind, I think Premier Clark actually took the high road and looked very diplomatic about it. And politicians, they're told all the time that people won't vote for them, and they often try to pick a fight to make the politician look bad. But the media and the social media coverage of the story is just awful, because in this instance, they're actually blasting her for doing the right thing by walking away from a confrontation. And she is right in this scenario. We do live in a democracy, and we don't have to vote for a specific candidate. But when the media shapes the narrative as a story, it really begs the question of whether the media is there to tell us the news, or if they are there because they want to tell us what they think of the news.
Yeah, and I think that's why we're here, is because I think unless you're dealing with something that is breaking and you're reporting live from the scene, you are ultimately talking about the story with some level of opinion, because there's multiple levels of producers, multiple levels of meetings that get talked about a certain story before it goes to air. It's not just using the great facts. And, that's all going to get mixed in at some stage, and that's just the world we live in. So, what a mess.
Yeah, so who knows if this is going to have an impact on the election, because it did just happen last week, and the election is just in 1, 2, 3 days from now. So that might be the story that shapes the entire election cycle of 4 years, is a simple, harmless encounter that got spread on Twitter,
And if that's the case, everyone will learn better for next time, hopefully.
Yeah, and if that shapes how people vote, then there will be consequences based on that, yes?
Indeed. All right, well, we can talk about our next story then, and that deals with actual consequences. Jordan Bateman from the BC chapter of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation talked to Christopher Wilson from The Rebel this week about the various fiscal plans from all of the parties that are out there. And the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, for those who are unaware, is basically an organization that spans the entire country and watches governments to ensure that they're not being too egregious with taxpayer spending. And they also ensure that what is being spent in a efficient and fair way, let's say. So this week, Jordan Bateman basically said, when talking to The Rebel, that the Liberals' fiscal plan is, quote, head and shoulders ahead of the other parties, and the NDP and Green Party platforms will lead to a huge tax increase on voters. And, he pretty much said what we said last week on the right side, is that this is in the platform of both the NDP and the Greens. And what the NDP and the Greens are saying is that they are calling the super elite those who make more than $150,000 a year. But the simple fact of this matter is that if you have a dual income family of, say, 2 teachers, you are at that $150,000 a year threshold of what the NDP and Green Party are calling super elite. Plus, there's also cases of saying that the NDP and Greens want to raise taxes on the upper middle class as well. So if they want to do that for the super elite, imagine what they're going to do for people below that $150,000 mark and families below that $150,000 mark. And ultimately, the BC Canadian Taxpayers Federation says that if a voter is looking to vote based on pocketbook issues, the choice is ultimately clear, that the only party who will end up enabling someone to take home more money than they do now, or bring home the same amount of money, is indeed the BC Liberals. And he also brings a very, very, very disturbing and sobering reminder here. And he said, look across the Rockies at what's going on in Alberta. That should send a chill across your spine.
Yeah, and it's very clear, like I talked about it last week in episode 14. You can find in the full show notes. Or you could just go to icanparty.ca just to look at the party platforms. It's right there in the NDP and the Green plans that they want to spend, and they want to raise taxes to do this. And they have said that they're going to raise taxes, but that only pays for about 10% of what they're promising.
Right.
So the remainder of the money has to be raised through other taxes that they're going to be putting on pretty much everybody.
And he actually talked about this right next. And, one of the things that they specifically take issue with is that the NDP wants to bring in another 114,000 new units of affordable housing. And that would ultimately cost the taxpayers $22 billion at around, $220,000 per unit. That's low cost, especially in BC. And the problem with this is that they would need to, produce an extra 10,000 units a year, but that's not feasible because the housing industry already produces 20,000 units a year, and it's bogged down by red tape and bureaucracy. So, while there are pocketbook issues of taxes and whatnot and the prices of housing affordability, the NDP plans for 114,000 new units isn't realistic. And he further goes on to say that there's no silver bullet to tackle the issue of property pricing in the Lower Mainland, because in most cases, new housing starts are actually limited by local governments imposing red tape. And he says that the focus should be on your local government at that stage and getting them to reduce the red tape, because of course, after all, it is municipal governments across Canada that grants permits for housing and rezoning applications. And it's not a problem that's just in Vancouver. It exists in Toronto, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, everywhere. So no one has solved this problem. So there's no reason to think that adding more to the tax bill or adding these 114,000 new units will solve this problem, when it's a matter of bureaucratic red tape and governments not spending and allocating resources properly, which is, of course, what the Canadian Taxpayers Federation looks down onto.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just the major cities too. The smaller cities are finding this as well. Like the Edmonton housing prices over the past 10 years have gone up quite a bit, as you well know. And the ones in Victoria, just this past year when everything got reassessed, housing prices went up by as much as 20% in some of our municipalities here in Victoria. And it's just something that happens through local government. It's not something that can even truly be controlled by a government in general. Sometimes that's just the market, and people will pay what they think something is worth for something.
Right.
And it's not really up to government to decide what that is, unless they want to turn into a totalitarian government.
Or allocation by command, as the communist states would call it. But
yeah,
the core of the matter here is that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is a respected organization for combating government waste and ensuring taxpayer money is spent effectively. And, the fact that none of this commentary from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation appears in mainstream media or even on the evening news, for that matter, to inform voters about, what the true facts are behind the party platforms, that's a little bit misleading and does a huge disservice to the population, especially those who are looking to vote based on pocketbook issues, because it's not easy to parse through a campaign platform. So, pocketbook issues aside, BC Liberals are apparently the place to be, but that's what the Canadian Taxpayers Federation says, and I think we would agree with that based on our discussion last week from the iconparty.ca website.
Yeah, and I think the main reason why the media hasn't been talking about this is because they've been too busy talking about hashtag IamLinda this entire past 2 weeks. And this doesn't fit in with that, so they ignore it completely. And that's why, even for me, I look at BC News all the time, and I didn't even find this. You were the one who came up with it, and you don't see it anywhere in any of the mainstream outlets. And if you looked for it in the news cycles, you wouldn't see it whatsoever. And I think the fact that they're not covering this when it's based on real issues, and the biggest issue this election has been housing, it talks about housing, they should be talking about this too,
Absolutely. And, that's one thing when we set out to begin the right side, is we said we're not going to, blacklist certain sources. We're going to allow sources on the show from every potential source, providing we can, of course, verify them and whatnot. And that's what we're doing. And, lots of people might see the Rebel as extreme, but in this case, it's some actual decent journalism that hasn't been told elsewhere. So it's a very important piece of information.
Yeah, and I think when you look at a certain news source, you have to look at who the actual author is, and not just the news source as an entirety. And in this case, I think Christopher Wilson, who lives in Vancouver and does a lot of BC commentary, he's actually usually quite on the level when it comes to issues in BC.
All right, you ready to move to Canada?
Well, I already live in Canada, so I don't have to move there, but I don't know. Whoever listens to this might think it's not a good place to move to BC, but It's still a very beautiful province, that's for sure. But as we move over to the federal government, let's have a look at another story that hasn't been covered very much in the news cycle, and that is that the Trudeau government vows to shut down debate in effort to pass legislative agenda. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but basically, to sum that up, the government says it will use its powers to shut down debate to get its agenda through the parliament. So Liberal House Leader Bardish Chagger announced on Monday that her government will make more use of time allocation, a practice that limits debate on specific bills or motions that will force votes and move the process along. And she cites the opposition's unwillingness to accept changes to the parliamentary procedure, failing to remember that the controversial Liberal parliamentary motion M103 was actually just recently passed with some opposition support. So she's using the excuse that the opposition doesn't want to accept any of these changes, yet they have accepted changes in the past. So that really raises the question there. So the government says it will make 5 changes to the parliamentary rules, including establishing a weekly Prime Minister's question period, which immediately angered the opposition parties, who said such moves should have the consent of all parties in the House. And the Conservatives and the NDP said they intend to use all delay tactics at their disposal as a protest. These options include forcing standing votes on routine matters, which causes delays as bells ring throughout the Parliament Hill to alert MPs to return to the House for a vote. And this is a quote, the NDP and the Conservatives are more united than ever in terms of fighting against this, said Conservative House Leader Candice Bergen, who spoke to reporters alongside the NDP House Leader Murray Rankin. Quote, it's a power grab by the Liberals, plain and simple, Mr. Rankin said. The Parliament is for the people of Canada. It's not for the government to make the government's work more efficient. It's to hold the government to account. And what listeners might realize from the story is that the Liberals, not content with having a majority in the Parliament already, they're doing everything they can to try and push their agenda through Parliament as soon as possible, without debate from the other parties of MPs that are duly elected to represent the people's interests. And I think something also to take note is that when the Conservatives and the NDP unite on an issue, it's a really big deal. It's clear that the two vastly different parties see the danger in making Parliament less democratic. And the article also notes that this fall will be the halfway point of the Liberals' term in power, which is the usual time to prorogue Parliament, which kills all bills that haven't received royal assent. This would explain why the Liberals are trying to push their changes through, as they're trying to look like they've actually done something positive in their first half term in power. And we might remember, going back 2 years ago, that prior to the 2015 election, the Liberals said that they will, quote, not resort to legislative tricks to avoid scrutiny. And with this, I think it's clear that they're blatantly doing just that. Those who voted for real change, they're surely upset that little has actually changed.
Well, I mean, of course, little has actually changed. All you had to do was look at Trudeau's first cabinet.
Yeah.
And also, I think this is a really hilarious story because you don't hear anything about this on the evening news because, of course, Parliament is sitting, and normally they like to bring a story every so often in about what was going on in the House. But this obviously didn't make the cut here. It looks like we got this piece from the Globe and Mail, obviously reported for print, which is good. But, at the same time, I can't help but feel if the tables were turned and it was the Conservatives who were doing this, as they were often criticized of in the last Parliament, that we would be hearing a lot more from the mainstream media on this, and it wouldn't be, just business as usual.
Yeah, and we did hear a lot about this whenever the Conservatives tried to make a change to something, they'd put it to a vote.
Oh yeah, even every time the House was prorogued, it was a big issue because that's a big word, apparently.
Yeah, and a lot of people thought that was undemocratic in itself. When, if you actually look at it, governments prorogue Parliament all the time.
Yeah, it's in the rule book. It's allowed.
Yeah, and that's how they move to a different session, to basically put a reset on Parliament so that new things can happen. And the fact that this wasn't talked about very much is really surprising, because one would think that with the Conservatives and NDP being united on an issue, that would be big news because
Yeah,
they're
and
rarely united on anything.
they can't prorogue right now because if they do that, the pot bill dies.
Yeah, and that was one of their big election promises, and they haven't done anything on that in 2 years. They haven't done anything on a lot of other things
Right.
in 2 years. So they want to get things done before it's prorogued, but they want to do
But
that
they're being
by,
obstructed, and they want to reduce the amount of checks and balances that they have to run through for this. And I think we should back up a bit and just explain that when Parliament is prorogued, it's essentially a reset button. Parliament is adjourned, and then everyone comes back, weeks or couple months after the fact, and every bill that was on the table dies, and they all need to be reintroduced with possible amendments to them, which means that anything is not passed, well, that's it for that bill. So it makes sense why they want to do this, but at the same time, there needs to be some discussion about the tactics that they're undertaking, and like you said, it's certainly a big thing when the Conservatives and the NDP get together to decide on something that we didn't hear anything about this in the evening news cycles. So something is indeed happening here that should have been talked about a little bit more.
yeah, and the Liberals, they're trying to get their agenda through, and they think that they're being obstructed by the opposition, but that's what the opposition is there for. They're there to hold the government to account and make sure that what they're doing is right for the people of Canada. And the fact that they're trying to make Parliament less democratic should be something that raises a lot of eyebrows to the Liberals, who had promised to be more open and fair and honest and, all these other buzzwords that they wanted to use during the election. And it's really clear that they're not doing that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I got one more story focusing in on the House of Commons and the federal government in general. That's our firing line segment for the week. And the headline is Conservatives blast Sajjan for linking Syrian conflict to climate change. So the story goes as follows. The Conservatives chastised the defense minister in question period Thursday for remarks he made last week linking the start of the Syrian civil war to climate change. In a speech at the Canada 2020 conference last Friday, Sajjan spoke about how to understand ripple effects led to military failures in Afghanistan, Libya, and Iraq. Sajjan also gave climate change as an example of an issue creating grievances in many different parts of the world. All right, so we have this story going on right now about the defense minister, and this is what we were able to find in the media this week, right? This story,
Yeah.
focusing in on the defense minister. But in the meantime, the page has been completely turned this week by the media in the news cycle from the comments that Sajjan previously made when he claimed he was the architect in one of the major operations undertaken in Afghanistan while he was posted there. The media used the same words, chastise and laid into, while talking about these stories. And, they continue to be posted online by the majority of TV coverage and nightly news that have shifted away from this ultimately. And the opposition is rightfully holding the defense minister to account on this story where he lied about his record. But from what we've seen and what's going on in the evening news, it seems quite clear that the media is changing the page and ultimately following the government's talking points in order to ensure that the discussion about the defense minister lying is not the one that's being covered, but rather the fact that the minister linked the Syrian conflict to climate change. And, there's a... Okay, go ahead.
And I think another thing to notice in the headline is that it's Conservatives blast Sajjan for linking Syrian conflict to climate change. It's not everyone. It's not opposition. It's Conservatives. And what's so special about the Conservatives blasting Sajjan for it? I think anything that links the Syrian conflict to climate change should be blasted, because that's such a ridiculous statement to make in the first place.
And plus, it also forwards the narrative, the media narrative, that all conservatives are inherently believe that climate change is some kind of hoax. But if you talk to the members and you look at the conservative policy, there's actually lots of environmentalists in that party. And
Yeah, and there's lots of environmental policies that a lot of the leadership candidates want to do to tackle climate change that don't involve a carbon tax or anything like that.
And like you can see, this is clearly a media hit job here, changing the page to fit what the government wants to talk about. The government made the minister unavailable for comment after he made the comments about himself orchestrating this mission in Afghanistan. And, there's something similar kind of going on here. You guys might remember from the previous government, Bev Oda was a minister, and she was forced to resign over a $16 glass of orange juice and other expenses. She was the minister for international cooperation, and initially the Harper government didn't request or force Oda to resign, but the continued media coverage is what ultimately led to that action. And the question that needs to be asked is ultimately, what's worse? Why is the media not continuing on this story when what's worse? Someone lying about their military record, or someone spending and expensing a $16 glass of orange juice?
Yeah, and I think the headlines that they used as chastised or laid into, they're false as well, because when you look at it, Trudeau was on record to defend him in public to the cameras, and he wasn't really chastised or laid into whatsoever. They were asking him to resign because he lied about his military record,
Right,
and he took honor and valor from someone who
exactly.
led a combat mission.
And that's the huge point here. And that's why people need to be asking is, what's worse? What's worse? Spending $16 on a glass of orange juice, or lying about your military record and taking valor and honor from someone else, right? And especially someone who is the defense minister.
Yeah, and I think that's something that everyone should be looking at and saying, why isn't the media talking about this more? They're talking about Sajjan, but they're not talking about him in the way that they should be.
Yeah. The government wanted the page to be turned, and the page was sufficiently turned.
Yeah.
So, it was really hard to find actual stories about the comments that he made this week once the media decided it was time to move on.
Yeah, and if you look in the news cycles now, you don't see anything about Sajjan whatsoever. The media's turned the page, and yet something that happened even earlier than Sajjan's story, which was the IamLinda one, they're still talking about it, even though it happened a week and a half ago. It's ridiculous how the media just decides how long the news cycle will be and how long we talk about a certain issue.
Yeah, I have an addendum for this, but we'd be here for another half an hour if we wanted to do that. But I think it's just safe at this point to move on to Word of the Week.
Yes.
And our word of the week is consequence. It's a noun, and it states, a result or effect of an action or condition. Many have been laid off from work as a consequence of the administration's policies. And the reason we have chose consequence as the word of the week is because the BC election is on May 9th, and elections have consequences that we can see and consequences that we can't see. And it's the media's job, rather, to help the public see what the potential consequences could be of electing any three of the major parties in BC. And I think it's quite clear from the coverage we've been doing for the last 2 weeks and a bit, specifically on the BC election, is that the media is not looking out for the public good and not warning the public of the potential consequences of this election.
No, and they don't seem to be doing it for any other elections too. If you look at the recent federal election in 2015, or you look at the most recent Alberta election, they don't seem to be telling us the news. Like I said before, they seem to be telling us what they think about the news and not letting us decide for ourselves. And they're trying to shape the narrative in a way that suits their own goals, whatever they may be. And elections do have consequences. We've seen that in Alberta with all the problems they have there. We've seen that in Canada as a whole, with the Liberals being elected and seeing what they're trying to do to Parliament. And we will potentially see this in just a few days in BC when everyone goes to the polls and decides who the government for the next 4 years is going to be.
That's entirely right. And, that is the number one thing I think we need to underscore as we wrap this one up, being the last one before the BC election, is that elections have consequences, and the party platforms are out there. They say what they're going to do, and if you give them the power, they will do that and more. So if you see the direction one party is going and you don't like it, you got to get out and vote for the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, I believe that's good for the right side this week, so we'll be watching the BC election with intent and watching for any potential stories that come out of Tuesday. But until next week, thank you for joining us, everyone, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
Yeah, and if you want to find out more about us, you can find us at rightsidenews.ca or on Twitter, Facebook at rightsideca, and also on iTunes. So we will see you next time. And remember, if you're in BC, go out and vote.